be elected as the president of Victims Support Europe at the end of last year. So I'm very proud to stand here in front of you. And I see also a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience. But for those who don't know me, I can tell you that I'm also the president of the board of directors of Slachtofferhulp Nederland. And if you translate it, it's Victim Support the Netherlands. So this event is my third VSE event as president. And I think it's a very important event with a very important topic. The subject is also particularly interesting for me because as a judge in the Netherlands for the last 30 years, many of the challenges that victims face, as well as the solution proposed in the VSE reports, have played out in real life in the courts and in the courtroom, whether for the victims or for me in my role educated and trying my best to ensure that victims were safe, well respected and had a chance to be heard. This is why I have welcomed these tireless efforts of VSE to address this issue and to really explore what it takes for our justice system to be safe for victims. We will hear lots about these issues in the next 2 hours. And so without further ado, I will hand over to VSE Executive Director Lev Altan, who will introduce our speakers of the next part of the program of this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Levent. I'm the Executive Director of Victims Support Europe, so welcome to you all. I won't spend any time doing introductions, really. I know everyone wants to get into the main body of the event. We produced and prepared this paper really because we saw that there was a need to review how we perceived and operated justice from a victim's lens. And we spent a lot of time looking at that. And this is why I'm really happy to welcome all of you to have a discussion on this. And even more importantly, I'm really delighted to welcome Richard Sonnenschein, who's the director at the DG Justice in the Criminal Justice Unit, Directorate, I should say. And they have been a particularly strong supporter of us as VSE, but also of victims. They lead on the issues, and they have really been pushing the boundaries of where the EU can and should go for victims. So I will hand over now to Richard. Thank you.
So thanks a lot. First, I have to adjust that a bit. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, congratulations, Rosa, to your election. I think, Levent, there's no reason to congratulate you, but thanks also for the invitation, and very happy, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm invited to be here today. I approached the victim rights area more prudently because we have normally Kasia, who represents very well our interest towards you as our main clients. And so far, I rely usually in here, and but slowly I'm getting into it, and I'm also looking forward to the event in June. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in the topic. It just means that normally I'm represented by somebody very competent in that area. So achieving safe justice for victims of crime, it's an integral part of EU policy on criminal justice. As you just heard, I'm in charge of that directorate, which does, of course, much more than only victim support. It is important to stress that the role of criminal justice is not limited to finding and punishing the offender of a crime. A crime often constitutes a serious violation of the fundamental rights of an individual. And therefore, the role of criminal justice is also to achieve, as much as possible, of course, justice for victims. And this can only happen if justice is safe for victims. That's why I very much like also today's motto of the event. But what does safe justice for victims actually mean? What does it stand for? In our understanding, it means that victims are supported and protected throughout the whole journey of criminal proceedings. This includes two elements. On the one hand, a more objective one. Victims must be effectively protected from any harm by the offender, and then maybe a mixed subjective, objective one. On the other hand, victims must also feel safe in contact with the authorities. And for a victim to feel safe, there are three conditions that must be fulfilled. First is sometimes maybe the most difficult one. We must listen to them. Secondly, victims should be always treated with respect and dignity by authorities. And last, the follow-up, that's maybe the objective one and more, should be designed in accordance with their individual needs. And I stress it also because that's something we have taken into account. I come to back later when we are looking now into revising the Victims Rights Directive. For you here in the room, this sounds all obvious, but in practice still, it often seems so difficult to achieve. So I'm sure we all here agree that one can only speak about safe justice in such basic minimum standards are actually respected. And that not only on the paper, but also in practice, and very important in all EU member states. And that's where we come in. So our EU rules, that's what we can best, but not only. Our legal framework and our policy on victim rights aim at achieving safe justice for victims. So in fact, the 2012 EU Victim Rights serves exactly this purpose. It provides for concrete rights for victims and corresponding obligations for our member states. So, however, after 10 years, the directive merits to be reviewed. This is what we have started last year. And there are certain rules in the Commission how to do that. So we have to carry out an evaluation, which is of course done also together with our stakeholders. So you were heavily involved in that. We published the result of that evaluation last year. And it showed that, as it is very often the case, that overall the directive has reached its objectives. It has improved the situation of victims in the EU as much as we can judge from our position, but it's also what we get as a feedback from you. Nevertheless, the evaluation and consultations done in the past month also revealed several shortcomings still in relation to the victim rights. I will not go into detail. You know that, in fact, much better than I do. But to eliminate these shortcomings, we are currently working on the revision of the Victims Rights Directive, and we will propose a number of legislative changes. Maybe before I have questions on that one, I will just tell you that we have it in the pipeline, it's ready, and we are just waiting for the green light. It's a bit linked to the ongoing negotiations on the violence against women or gender-based violence proposal. There are currently strategic reasons for us to wait a little bit more. But as I said, we are ready to go, and then let's see where it leads us. In addition, the Commission is, of course, working also on non-legislative actions. These include the implementation of the EU strategy on victim rights 2020 to 2025. This work is equally important. Not everything can be achieved by legislation, so we have the tendency to think sometimes in the Commission that the world looks just as beautiful as we think when we are coming up with legislation, but that's not the case. So some of the strategy's actions are particularly important also for achieving, coming back to today's motto, safe justice for victims. In January, the Commission launched its biggest campaign of victim rights. Of course, you know that very well, at least many of you. It's called I Will Keep My Eyes Open, the campaign. It covers all EU member states, but we focus particularly on 10 selected countries where actions are intensified. And in parallel, we are doing then also publicity for this campaign on social media, and we're having social events linked to it. The campaign, as you might have maybe noticed, is directed more to the younger generation. It's directed to the friends and family of victims, and it calls on them to have the eyes open. That's why we have that motto for victims of crime around them, to sensibilize actually for victims, so not to close the eyes when you see something. So to see them and to offer them the required support as much as you can, then of course, and if you cannot do on your own, to refer them to the services specialized on victim support. After the successful launch of the campaign in these 10 focus countries, the so-called non-blinking challenge, to ask my colleagues what exactly it was, but I guess you know, the campaign is now moving to its next stage. So we have a campaign toolbox, including also pictures and films, and that will be distributed and made available to all interested parties. And there, of course, you're very much welcome to take part when it comes to further disseminate here the outcome of that campaign. Another important action under the EU Victim Rights Strategy in today's context is ensuring specialized support and protection for the most vulnerable victims. This includes child victims, victims of domestic violence, victims of hate crime, victims of terrorism, and lately also very much in the focus, victims of war crime. One concrete example here of our actions, I'm happy to announce that the Commission has decided to ensure the continuity of the EU Center of Expertise for Victims of Terrorism. We have selected a consortium that will carry out its task for the next 2 years. And I guess it's not a secret for you that the consortium composed of Victim Support Europe has succeeded in the public procurement and will manage the center for the next years. Moreover, we continue to provide for funding opportunities for projects on victim rights. In this context, I would like to inform you that we will soon open a call for proposals for action grants. They will include the projects on victim rights as well. It's not only victim rights, but also. And this year we dispose of over 10 million euros for the projects on victim rights, procedural rights of suspects and accused persons in criminal proceedings, and also e-justice. Call will be open 4th of May, and then we will have time until October to propose projects. That was it, what I wanted to say. I would like to take the opportunity also to thank all of you, since I'm here the first time and meeting you in person, before it was always online, to really thank you for all the support. For us, it's often not visible what you do, but of course, we get all the feedback from our main stakeholders, from the people who are lobbying for you. But for me, it's a good opportunity to really thank you in person for everything you're doing in the interest of the victims. And that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you for that introduction. And I think it's important for all of us to understand and know about the activities and actions of the European Union. It's, despite my accent, I'm actually grown up as a European and continue to believe in its benefits and values. So we have to know about how much the European Union does, but also how much more we can do. So thank you for the openness about the situation with the Victims Directive. We wait with impatience for it, knowing that there are so many millions of victims who are not protected by the current proposals and need something like this new Victims Directive to help them. One of the things that we also recognize about the European Union is that there are many different institutions. What we've realized in VSC is that sometimes we're not focused enough on those working at the local level, trade unions, civil society actors, but also mayors, for example, which is why I'm really delighted now to welcome Jose Antonio Moreno Diaz, who is the legal advisor on immigration, asylum and integration issues at the European and Economic Social Committee. We've over the years developed alliances together, and I hope we can continue to do so. Thank you.
Let's put the micros. Depends on the tone of the speaker. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I wanted to thank you in behalf of the European Economic and Social Committee. As you know well, the European Economic and Social Committee is the voice of the organized civil society across European Union. First of all, I'm sorry because I have to leave immediately after my words because I suffered an accident during this weekend, and I'm not in my best conditions to speak, but I'm going to try to do my best. It is an honor and a personal pleasure to be able to address you today. On 2020, European Economic and Social Committee approved its opinion about European Commission proposal on a European Union strategy on victims' rights 2020-2025. I want to mention some key points. First of all, European Economic and Social Committee warmly welcomes European Union strategy as it should mean. First of all, long-term planning. Secondly, a proper coordinated implementation of policies across a wide range of sectors and actions. And finally, no victims is forgotten. Secondly, this strategy needs a clear action plan, details, when, how, and evaluation of measures. Thirdly, a specific focus on gender-based violence victims and domestic violence victims. We have to take into account the European Commission proposal on 8 March 2022 during this year, and we are now waiting for the feedback coming from the Council on this very crucial proposal directive. There's a form of terrorism against women and girls across European Union, against the 50% of the European Union population, so it is crucial and it's very important. And finally, about the strategy about victims' rights needs further clarification. Promotion of training, not only judicial or law enforcement agents, also specific staff working with victims of crime, for example, specific hate crimes victims that have a specific points to deal with. Funding civil society organization plus enhanced cooperation, civil society organization and authorities. National campaigns should be adapted to the needs and the specific characteristics of particularly vulnerable groups, as the previous speaker said, and communities. And finally, European Commission should integrate victims' agenda into all European Union funding programs. Now, in the European Economic and Social Committee, we are working on, I'm the rapporteur of this, and last week we had the first study group meeting about the anti-trafficking directive updating that was presented during October last year. You have to know that the anti-trafficking directive is from 2011, so it's very outdated. And now the Commission is proposing a new text, a new draft. We are working on it. We are talking about new forms of trafficking, for example, forced marriages, that is a new kind of trafficking, and new ways to traffic people through digital measures and through social media. And we are asking in this very, very draft text about a specific attention for victims in this ground. For example, third country nationals victims of trafficking, and to establish a mandatory residence permit for them, especially talking about sexual exploitation victims. Thank you very much for taking into account the voice of the European Economic and Social Committee, and good work this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose, especially given your injuries as well. I could see you wincing there through the pain, so I think that shows the real commitment to victims. Quickly moving on, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Petra Klein now, who's our Vice President of Victims Support Europe, but also Vice President at Weissering, which is one of the largest victim support organisations, I believe, in the world. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lev. Dear VSE members, distinguished speakers, colleagues and friends. In my capacity as Acting Vice President of Victims Support Europe, and on behalf of all our members, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to our debate, Achieving Safe Justice for Victims of Crime, to mark the European Day for Victims of Crime. 33 years ago, in Stockholm, Sweden, Victims Support Europe declared 22nd February to be the European Day for Victims of Crime. The day offers the momentum to remember those who have suffered at the hands of criminals. Many millions every year, children and adults, women and men, poor and wealthy, residents and visitors to the EU with reported and unreported crimes. This day is an opportunity in itself to appraise our successes, but also to explore the complex causes that are impeding full access to victims' rights and services in contemporary Europe. In late 2021, VSE embarked on a new initiative to develop our policy efforts to understand how we can make the criminal justice system work in a way that is less harmful to victims and their families. In this 33rd edition, we will launch our new discussion paper, Achieving Safe Justice for Victims of Crime, that addresses the question on what makes the criminal justice system safe for victims and set out recommendations on better path forward to criminal justice. What is presented in the paper articulates a vision that can form the core of a new forward-looking model for safe justice systems in the EU. We will discuss the problems and barriers encountered by victims during their journey to achieve justice, from the moment the crime is committed to the outcome of the criminal proceedings. We all know that the number of unreported crimes is many times higher than what we see in criminal proceedings. So what is needed to facilitate access for those victims of crime? More information about victims' rights? More access to support from the very beginning after someone became a victim of crime? For example, in hospitals, at work, in the family, even when the crime was committed years ago? How can all these unknown victims be reached for help, support, protection, compensation, and justice? Given that the European Commission has announced a possible upcoming proposal for a revision of the Victims Rights Directive, we believe it is key to seize the momentum to go to the point and put forward the solutions to the existing problems. This revision, indeed, is essentially because it has the power to strengthen existing rights, establish clearer obligations for member states and new rights for victims. Fundamentally, our response to this should involve physical and mental health measures, criminal sanctions, economic cohesion, and safe justice, all elements brought together by our new policy and discussion papers. I thank you all for joining us here in persona and online. I sincerely hope you will enjoy today's program and knowledge exchange. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Petra. I think it gives a good context to where the origins of this paper are and where we think we need to go in terms of a cohesive approach to victims' rights. One of the reasons that I have stayed for so long in this field, having come from the UK civil service, focusing my entire career on catching criminals and countering terrorism, one of the reasons I've stayed for so long is because of my work with and talking to victims themselves. And the next speaker, Philippe van Steenkiester, is a perfect example of what inspires me and many others to remain in this area. Through the tragedy of his loss, we got to know each other He's inspired me. He works extremely hard every single day for victims of terrorism. And I think what's really important for all of us is to understand how in our policies, the roots of those policies are the experiences of victims. So over to you, Philippe.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe I would like to start with a small reminder. Our society is really based on security. It all started somewhere from there. Before society was really developed, people, to be able to have security, paid taxes to have the security. For example, when they traveled to the country, they reached the small city. For entering the city, they had to pay taxes for security. It's really a key element. We also came together to be able to protect ourselves. Of course, security is not always granted, and once there is an issue, justice starts to play its role. Now, what is justice? Of course, we provide justice to be sure to give a sign towards society that justice is done, but also to make sure that the offender is not doing again the actions. But we have always the victims there. And I think the role of the victims has been often neglected. When we don't take into consideration the victim is in fact a failure. Something failed and a victim got created. If the victim is not supported rightly, it would be very difficult for this victim to reintegrate society. And if she can't do this one, the victim and also everyone around the victim, it will be a proof that something is not working. And so people might lose again trust in that society that has been built. So the reintegration of the victim is a sign that our society, our system is working properly. So in fact, what we are talking here is a fundamental issue of our society. In fact, what is the purpose for helping a victim of terrorism? What we all want to reach is very simple. It's really simple. We would like that all the victims, without any discrimination, can rebuild themselves to be able to reintegrate society as good as possible and become again, if possible, also a proud citizen of our society. That's what we try to achieve with supporting the victims. Now, rebuilding, or for a victim to work on this resilience and rebuilding themselves, it's something very difficult. To confront a victim is very difficult because, again, it's a failure. We talk with someone where the system didn't work properly. It's very difficult to confront the victim because we also identify ourselves what could happen. It's very unpleasant. We don't know and always how to communicate with victims. So we have to be conscious what are the needs of the victims. And one of the key elements when you're a victim, in fact, all your education, all your values have been fragmented. And what is left over is somewhere your dignity. This is one of the last elements you still have. You still feel human being because you've got this dignity. And if people don't understand what it means, dignity, if people who try to help victims don't see what it means, you could in fact breaking down the last pillar this victim has to rebuild themselves. So the approach towards victims must be extremely important. We have to know how we do this. Simple example. I lived it myself and many other victims. People feel sad when you're a victim, and they come with pity. Never have pity for a victim, because when you have pity for a victim, you destroy his own dignity. Okay, so you really must be able to understand the victim. If the victim feels that you come with pity, for example, he will feel that, in fact, I'm not understood. And when the whole and surrounding of the victim doesn't give the right approach, even they try it, but they don't know how to do this, the victim will again feel isolated. And in fact, what do we create there? We create a fragmentation. We create a fragmentation of our society. And that's the exact opposite of what we need to do. We also, to be able to provide this right dignity from the victim, we have to be able to evaluate, identify and evaluate the damage done to the victim. Physical damage, but also emotional, psychological damage. This has to be done in a right way. If you don't do this in a right way, then again the victim will feel not understood and it will fragment herself from society. And again, when the victim fragments herself, it's not only one person. When we have one victim, we can easily say we have in fact 10 victims, because there is the spouse, for example, the children, the whole social surrounding of the victims. They are impacted by this. When they see that the person they love can't rebuild themselves, can't reintegrate, well, they feel also the trust in society gets lost. So when we talk about one victim, in fact, we talk about many victims. So this right evaluation must be done. And so it's a very complex matter. A victim, we are all individuals. We have different needs at different times. Sometimes a need from one victim today is different than the other victim, but maybe over 10 days we have the same needs, or 1 year. It's really complicated. Try to put these things in a concrete matter. We follow a little bit what the experience from Spain, that there are 4 pillars for building the victims. It's dignity, meaning the right recognition, the right support. Also memory, that the victims are not forgotten, that we can also learn from this without re-victimizing the victim, of course. To know the truth and to have justice. Now, what is truth? That's again a very complex matter. There is not one truth. There are many truths. When a victim has an impact, as a survival instinct, often you get into a tunnel vision. You need to survive, so you get into a tunnel vision, and this becomes the reality of the victim. The reality of justice is often different. Justice is done on facts, where everything is analyzed properly, but it's not always conformed to the truth of the victims. I will give you a small example for the 22nd of March attacks in Brussels. Some victims believed strongly that there was shooting going on. During the trial, during the analysis, we understand there was no shooting going on. What happened? Some victims, they enter in tunnel vision, which is totally logic and normal because they protect themselves, they need to turn in surviving mode. They heard noises like shootings. It seems like these were, for example, the glasses from the building in the airport which fell down. It made noise, bang, 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 bang. Then they see, during the procedures or during the acute phase, they see, for example, charges from weapons, rifles, laying on the ground. So automatically you say, here is a real danger, and there is shooting going on. This is the reality of a victim. We realized later on that these charges were, for example, from the armed forces, because the caliber, the ammunition size is different. It's NATO caliber and not from, for example, an AK-47 assault rifle. So we have different visions, but we have to respect for the victims, because they have to rebuild with their truth. They have to rebuild themselves with their own truth. So we have to respect and we have to support them in rebuilding and not confront them with something else. So the truth is really something important and difficult to understand always. Another truth, for example, is also why is it important? Because victims have to understand, from what did I become a victim? Suddenly become a victim, I have to understand, or many victims need to understand, why am I a victim of a cause? For example, 22nd of March attacks was an ISIS attack. Many victims, they heard about ISIS in the press, but in fact without really understanding how it works, who they are. So understanding of what I'm a victim is extremely important. So there also you have to do this work. I take a simple example. For example, today we all heard what is ISIS because it was quite in the press, but things are happening today, for example, also in the Congo. Most people don't understand what's going on in the Congo. The day you become a victim of one of these issues, you will start to work on it. You will want to know what's going on. And next to this truth, of course, comes justice. If, as a victim, if you know the person who harmed you is at the court, that is very good, but you also need, you also want justice for everything what stands behind it. A simple example, most of us have seen the movie The Godfather. You have the famous Don Corleone who decides to kill someone. He orders someone to kill a person. The person who is pulling the trigger, okay, we identified him, we bring him in front of justice, but if you only have this person and not the Don Corleone who ordered the killing, there is an issue. So we need to know the truth, and we need to go to the bottom line that the right justice is giving. Yes, so justice is always complicated because for sure when it happens 1 year or many years afterwards, because the victim, we do everything to rebuild. The victim is trying to rebuild themselves. Once justice comes, in fact, we are reopening the whole problematics. But still, it is one of these pillars that is necessary for the victim to rebuild. And we always say it's like a healing, a wound that has been badly healed. So when justice comes, in fact, we have to reopen the wound. We have to reopen the wound to put out the infections so it can heal properly. But there will always be the scar. We should never forget this one. So for today, we have, for example, the trial from the 22nd of March, Brussels attacks. We are almost 7 years later. It's very, very difficult, but it's necessary. It's really necessary. Even though some victims, they want to disconnect because it's too difficult for them. Yes, but for other victims, it's necessary, but also for society. We have experienced, well, I myself or the association also 4 trials. The first one was the trial from the shooting in Rue de Dries, which was from Abdeslam, when he tried to escape in March 2016 from his safe haven place. A second trial we participated was the Jewish Museum from Belgium. A third one was also the Paris attacks from the 13th November. Terrorist attacks, and the fourth one was the 22nd, well, it's right now, the 22nd of March attacks. All 4 trials were totally different. As a victim, we experienced it totally differently. The trial from the shooting from Rue de Dries is a correctional trial. It happened very fast. In fact, too fast. We didn't understand really, as a victim, what are the details about it, but judgment was done. During the trial from the Jewish Museum for Belgium, this was until now the longest trial. It took almost 3 months. It was an Assise trial. As victims, it was very difficult because the defendants tried to create the face of a complot. A complot was going on. This was their defense. And by doing this, they hurted victims from the Jewish museum, or the persons, the family members from the ones who died. It became, yeah, it was a trial where it was almost an insult to the victims. So we must understand that when you try to do a right trial, it can be very, very harmful for the victims. On the Paris attacks trials, there we all believe that the defendants worked completely with the trial, but it was not the case either. And today we have the Brussels attacks trial, which is becoming all very complicated, as we know. We heard the issues about the boxes, which is difficult for the victims because the trial was delayed. Now we hear the issues about security. We all are aware that human rights must be supported, because if you don't support the basic fundamentals from society and also the human rights, in fact, you start to play the games of the terrorists. The terrorists, they want to fragmentate society. If you start to also not respect anymore the basic rules of society, you play that game, in fact. So it is extremely important for also the victims that all the basic rights of our democracy are respected. I would like maybe to read a small letter that arrived, or that was sent 1 week ago by a victim. She gave me authorization to read it, for you to understand what are issues that can happen with justice from the point of view of victims. I would just quick take my computer. Oops, let's try it. Right. Dear Madam Sir, I'm the proud wife of a victim who died in the second terrorist bombing in Zaventem on March 22nd, 2016. I've been through untold agony, and I'm not through at all. The trial that finally started on December the 6th, 2022, should bring me clarification, should give me some answers to my questions. Until February 6, 2023, I still had hope that justice would be done at the March 22nd trials. As of February 7th, that hope is completely gone, and I share the idea, along with many victims of the March 22nd attacks, that this trial is becoming a little bit like a circus. The day of the bombing started with chaos, lots of chaos, and that chaos never got resolved. Chaos because relief efforts started much too late for the second bombing at Zaventem due to poor and slow communication. Chaos from the media sending misinformation into the world. Chaos due to the crisis center that did not work at all and which employed incompetent people. Chaos because of poor coordination. Chaos because relatives were not accompanied in a humane manner and were informed far too late that their loved ones had died. Chaos because the flood of documents that the next of kin, victims who were injured, have to fill out again, and then at the end of the story, they have to beg to have their expenses reimbursed, where we have to write a cover letter to until this day as to why we should be entitled to this financial support. I no longer have any privacy. All my life and that of my husband, I have had to tell dozens of times, down to the most intimate details. Everything can be read by anyone, including the defendants, in the voluminous files from the 22nd of March attacks. My entire financial condition, even that of 3 years before the attack, has been revealed and is known by all agencies, the entire family, to every corner of the world. Amlin, the Zaventem Airport Insurance, asked me to describe in detail what my husband and I spent our money on for the last 3 years before the attack. They asked me to copy all bank statements from those 3 years before the attacks. Amlin asked me to write a report of how do I feel. And this was 3 months after the attacks. I answered all this like a robot, which I would not do anymore now. And then finally, the trial started. I went through the information day in September, where there were detailed explanations about the building, so the infrastructure, the process itself and the facilities. Afterwards, I thanked everyone via Victims Welcome from Justice for the tremendous work they did to make everyone comfortable. It is impossible to do it right for everyone, but they have done their best. I felt it like this. That the trial was postponed from October to December, for the first weeks we didn't know why, was a very hard blow for me and for a lot of victims. I was fortunate to have finally ended up with a very good therapist, psychological therapist, just last October, because otherwise I don't know if I would still be in this world. So much for the introduction. I cry for help. On December the 1st, I received a request to come and testify on the 24th of January at 9 in the morning. My body and my brain set to that date. On 19th of January, I received an email from Justice that the date for my testimony, as well for other victims, has been moved to February 27th at 2 p.m. I was angry, disappointed, and so on. But I did everything I could to quickly get myself back together. My body and my brains were living again for that new date. On Tuesday, February the 7th, suddenly I received an email back from Justice that the new date for my testimony would be March the 9th at 2 p.m. I can tolerate very much and am understanding from many situations, but there are limits. I'm already far beyond my own limits. I can't handle this chaos anymore. From the beginning of the process, there was no structure. The planning was done far too late, and there was a planning that we see that too many people had to speak on one day, causing a cumulative delay every day. The first time there was a change in the schedule for the witnesses, that was okay for me, even though I felt it pretty hard. The second time, I still feel it narrowly acceptable, but on the third time, altering my or our testimonies, I found it an outright insult to my mental health. I feel that I've already been punished every day since March 22nd, 2016, and I can no longer cope with the third modification. I so desperately wanted to try to tell the text I had made for my husband in front of the jury and the presiding judge. I wanted to come and testify what a wonderful, good man he was and how we lived together. The third amendment, the date of 9th of March, is absolutely not suitable for me under no circumstances. I responded within an hour of receiving the email because at the time I still thought one could be amended, or it could still be amended, but no response at all from the registry. Totally disrespectful, totally rude, I find this, or so I experienced it anyway. I find it so terrible that people like the president of the court, for whom I had a lot of respect, my lawyer, and the organization of the trial are asking, demanding that I have to justify myself again and again, that I have to give a motivation, that I have to give away part of my privacy, why I cannot come on March the 9th. I have communicated to one person, and that lady understood me completely, and I thought this would be sufficient, but it is not. In my opinion, there are two big reasons why everything is messed up. As long as they plan to invite too many people to speak on one day, it will remain an eternal chaos, and that third date for the witnesses will certainly have to be moved again and again and again. Totally unacceptable. Questioning. No one in the room who understands this, and certainly the jury, for whom questioning is very important. Every time someone from the investigation judges, the fire department, DOVO, DVI, police, etc., spoke, we have to save our questions for these people. So these people are in fact witnessing, and the civil parties have to wait until the witnessings are done before asking questions. Only after everyone has spoken, meanwhile, since December 19, 2022, we would be allowed to ask our questions. Finally, on Thursday, February 9, the question began. How does one organize to call back the 10 numbered witnessings for weeks to finally answer the hundreds of questions? What normal brain can handle such a thing? I will stop here. What I try to explain is we are now many, many years further. We have learned a lot through all member states of how to approach victims. We have directives, but still on the practical side, there are issues. There are issues because I have sometimes the impressions that we are putting plasters on big wounds. What is extremely important is that we bring our experience all together and work together on all levels. And only because we all play part, practitioners, decision makers, we all play part of a bigger scheme, and to reach the right of the victims, meaning supporting our society, our values. For this one, we have to cooperate all together. Everyone with his own expertise, we have to trust each other, we have to work together. I think this is extremely important. I didn't read this letter to criticize Belgium, not at all. I just read this letter because I think it's our role to bring forward what is not working. But because someone has to do it. But the whole idea is that we constructively work together. We have to learn from the mistakes from the past to build a better future for the next generations to come. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I won't summarize everything that you said, but I think that your conclusion is really a perfect opening to the presentation of the Safe Justice paper and why we have put this together. And I think what's particularly important is hearing the words of people who are experiencing the justice system and how things which others experience on a day-to-day basis from their jobs, from their perspectives, and see, well, this is the way the system works. What else can we do? Why should we change? But when you hear it from the perspective of the experience and pain and of victims, you have to see it from a different perspective. You have to understand that something has to change, and it can't just go on as it is. And I think that's, now then, let's see if it works. Ah, there we go. And that's where we started off from. So really, for 40 years now, more than 40 years, we've had victimology, victims' rights. We've been talking about this for 40 years. In 1985, the UN adopted the Declaration on Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. And so that's 1985, nearly 40 years ago. Countries from around the world said, this is important, we know what we need to do. We need to do support, we need to do protection, we need to do information. And we've had that for the last 40 years. Council of Europe recommendations, an EU framework decision, 2012, the Victims Rights Directive, on and on and on. We've had the same rights, the same issues going through. And yet, through all of this time, what's changed? Well, yes, progress has been made. We have put in place a whole range of rights, but as Philippe and many others testify, every single time we do any piece of study or research into the situation of victims, we consistently find that their rights are not wholly in place, that they cannot exercise those rights. We have studies which show, for example, you have a right to information, but maybe only 30% of victims always get this information. Imagine how our justice systems would function if that was the same approach to defense rights. You have the right to a letter as the accused. You should have it and you should get it. Imagine if 30% of defendants didn't get that letter, the whole system would crumble. And yet we still today seem to find it acceptable that victims don't have their rights in the same way and to the same extent. So that's the starting point of this entire paper. Are we going about this all wrong? After 40 years, do we need to think differently about the way our justice systems function and how victims fits within that system? The time is extremely important. The time is now. As we've heard, there are many different European laws either being published or in negotiation. So we have a momentum here, both in the European Union, but also in the Council of Europe, also in the UN. The UN has recently published an amazing model provisions for victims of terrorism. So there's a lot of momentum here, but we have to ask a fundamental question. Does something really need to change in our thinking so that we can ensure that victims' rights are put in place in practice? And if that's the case, how does our European laws and our national practices have to change to reflect that? So this is what is the foundation of the Safe Justice paper. And we've called it a discussion paper for a reason, because some of the things are challenges. We don't have all the answers, but what we wanted to be able to do is really explore really difficult questions that others are not so willing to ask. People are not really willing to talk about legal aid for victims. They're not really willing to talk about the role of victims or to look at their national justice systems. And we wanted to start a discussion on this. And in the process of that, I think we found lots of the answers as well. The starting point is that when you look at victims' rights, when you look at the policies and laws for victims, the starting point is not the existing justice system. The starting point is that we have to address victims' needs. We have to address the impact of crime on victims. We have to make sure this is all done in a victim-sensitive manner. That's the starting point. Design solutions around victims first. Only after that may we need to balance all of those solutions based on other wider justice principles, making sure that it does comply with fair trial rights, equality of arms, process and costs, all of those things. At this moment in time, a victim has a right, but then they're told, yes, but it's going to take too long. It's going to cost too much money. It's going to be too difficult. We don't have someone available. The entire system is not designed to make the right accessible. It's designed to make it available when it's suitable to the justice system as a whole. And when it comes to making these rights and the operation of justice victim sensitive, there are some fundamental principles. I know they're difficult to see here, but you have your papers as well. We have the respectful treatment of victims. We have the recognition of victims. We also need to make sure that victims are empowered. They've lost this feeling of safety. They've been disempowered, and their ability to participate and to recover and to reintegrate is really reliant on the empowerment of the victims. And our justice systems have to be designed so that they are safe for victims and that the well-being of the victims are paramount. So we've looked at all of it from that perspective. We've really looked at the challenges and the barriers to victims. And what we've said is that there are thinking about justice from a safe justice perspective, from achieving these objectives and applying these principles, there are these major areas where we can see opportunities for improvement. We can improve the ability of victims to report crime, to be informed, to have a meaningful participation in the justice system, to be safe and to achieve restoration. I won't spend too long on all of these. I know that we have an amazing panel who can really go into some of these issues. But just to give some flavor of the types of issues that we're covering. With respect to the reporting of crime, you see the problem already there. Large numbers of victims never ever report the crime, never seek support in the first place. That's a fundamental problem in our societies. Now, if you look at EU FRA reports, the Fundamental Rights Agency, if you look at other studies, there's lots of reasons for that. You can more or less break it down to a number of victims feeling it's not worth reporting, and a number of victims who don't feel safe or are able to report. They're blocked from reporting. But if you delve really into why they don't feel it's worth it, there's a lot of societal problems that we have to resolve. If you don't have trust in the system, if you report a hate crime and nothing is done about it, or the actual crime that's charged is one of violence, but not violence based on a hate bias, then you feel that it's not worth it. If there is no progress in the case, if you're not informed about why it's happening, if you're ignored by the police or the prosecution, of course you won't feel it's worth it. So there are many ways in which we can improve the way that we respond and the way that we operate our system to overcome those barriers and the trust and distrust that victims have in the system. And the other part of this is really overcoming the fear barriers, making sure that it's safe for victims to report. And that could be because of fears of the perpetrator living in a high crime area, because it's organized crime, because the perpetrator is someone you know. But it can also be because of fears of how the authorities will treat you. Your data may be passed on to immigration authorities. The police and others themselves may be biased in their approach as well. So there are many different ways in which there are barriers based on the fear. And the solutions that we look at are wide and varied, coming with respect to anonymous reporting, online reporting, third-party reporting, improving the ability of victims to provide evidence, so reducing the administrative burdens on victims. There are many ways in which we can simply reduce the barriers to reporting, and we have to. Secondly, we look at how we can improve victims' ability to be informed. How are we informing victims? They have the right to information, but actually in an upcoming paper in March, we'll be talking about a communications framework. What that means is it's not just about informing victims, but it's also about ensuring that they can be heard. And informing victims isn't the right word. Communication is much more. It's making sure the information is there, victims understand it, and they can act on it. That's communication. And just simply providing victims with a leaflet is not the way that you'll ensure that they can make any use of that information. So there's many different aspects to this, but one of the key aspects is that we need to do this in a coordinated, coherent fashion. With large numbers of actors trying to provide large numbers of information in different ways, you have duplication, gaps, and confusion, and a coordinated process for delivering and receiving information is the fundamental way to go. We also have solutions with respect to interpretation and translation, where there are significant limitations in the access to interpretation services for cross-border victims. When it comes to the ability to participate, this was a real challenge. There are rights to be heard, there are rights to give evidence, and there are rights to participate. But nobody seems to really explain what the notion of right to be heard is. And what we've said is that actually we need to set some parameters around this. It needs to be much clearer what are we trying to achieve by the right to be heard. Because the reality is that for most, the right to be heard means the right for you to be heard when you're useful to us. And what we're saying is that that's not what this right is about. It's one part of it, but the other part is to empower victims to enable them to be heard when they need to be heard. So there are many solutions and approaches that we can take to achieve that. Not only do they need to have that right, but they also need to be enabled to practice that right. And there are many different ways in which we can implement solutions within the justice system so that they're respectful, so that they give victims the opportunities. You heard the examples from Philippe, where victims are preparing themselves to be heard, and then the system itself says, sorry, we don't need you now. And maybe it's postponed. Sometimes, at least in the UK, they say we don't need you at all. So there are many different solutions that we've seen within that. There are two big parts to this, though, in terms of enabling victims. One is that the support services are in place, both outside the criminal justice, but also by accompanying victims and by ensuring that services like the police and prosecution have their own specialist capability, by having court-based victim support services. And the other is by having the legal support as well. Legal aid is dramatically limited or drastically limited within the Victims Directive. And we all know why, because it costs money. But that's not the right way of determining whether you should have legal assistance and legal representation. First, you have to work out whether you need it, why it's important. And then if the budget isn't there, you either make sure the budget is there or you find out how to design the system to accommodate victims appropriately. So there are many different solutions when it comes to participation. And the final part, I know I'm a few minutes over run, but the final part of this, sorry, the two final parts to this, I forget my own. Two parts to it. One is protection, absolutely critical. That's protection in terms of physical protection, protection in terms of secondary victimization, protection in terms of privacy. There are so many ways in which this can be improved. The individual needs assessment is a process. It's not a tick box activity. We need to have an entire process designed around individual needs assessment to determine what their immediate support needs are, to determine what their protection needs are, and to determine how to put that into place. And it needs to be coordinated. We shouldn't have situations where victims are told they need and deserve protection, but there's another authority that makes the decision as to whether they get it, and that authority says no. The assessment is critical. We also have to make sure that there's a clear, consistent set of protection measures across the European Union, and not just for some groups of victims. We all support wholeheartedly the actions of the European Commission on violence against women and on specific crimes. This is absolutely essential. It has to be put in place. It must be negotiated. But for some of these issues, they have to be there for all victims. There shouldn't be a hierarchy of victims, and something like a fundamental right to protection should not be available to only one group of victims, but to all those who are at risk. So there are many ways in which protection needs to be put in place. The privacy of the victim needs to be protected. There needs to be privacy by design, and we heard some of the issues there. Half the time the presumption is that the information on victims has to go out. I think first of all you have to work out why should it do that. Privacy is a fundamental right. It is not subordinate to other fundamental rights. It is of equal status to all the other rights, and it should be treated in this way. And finally, we have the restoration of victims financially, emotionally, and otherwise. There are two parts to this. It's really making sure that victims are not and do not lose financially as a consequence of their participation in criminal proceedings. But it's also about making sure that the compensation system itself works. That means that we have state compensation and offender compensation working together for the best interests of the victims. It means that victims get the money when they need it. They get the decision when they need it. And you don't have situations where victims are receiving a few euros per week when they're trying to pay for the funeral expenses or the repatriation of their loved one to their home country. That's useless to them. And it comes at the time when it's useless to them because it's several years later. There are existing excellent systems in place, like that in the Netherlands, which make sure that the state and offender compensation systems work together for victims and in their best interests. So what this paper does is it really explores the problems, but really tries to open our eyes to the idea that we don't have to accept justice as it's done now. In fact, we have to change the way that justice is done now, because otherwise we will fail victims, but we're also failing our societies as a whole. It's breaking down social cohesion, breaking down trust in our systems as a whole. So with that, I can now, I think, welcome Rosa back, who will be moderating the panel, and we'll have a few people on here. The people that are speaking, I think, are amazing speakers who can represent some of these ideas. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Rosa.
Sit all down behind the table. That's a good procedure. Sorry. Mics. Joan, there is a mic coming. the back.
Oh,
It's yours.
okay.
Sorry for all this, but we are living in a wireless world, but we are sitting between wires, so. Lev, I want to thank you for this great presentation of the Safe Justice paper. I think there's a lot of work done, and what we see, and I hope behind this table there are a lot of people who have personal experience, but also experience in their work with victims and what they need. So I really hope that we can go on and make the steps who are so important for victims, especially when they come in a criminal procedure. I must say, when I was introduced, I worked for a lifelong time as a judge, and I like the work, but I had also a lot of contact with victims and relatives of victims, and of course not the one who were in front of me, but with a lot of people in other cases. And for me, there was always a big difference between sitting in a court and for one day or sometimes for a couple of weeks, and looking in the eyes every day of victims and relatives, because I think that's the only way when you really understand what's going on and where they go through. And also that's the same in criminal procedures, if I may say so. So I think that the Safe Justice paper give good ideas about what has to be done in court, but I think we really need people who are very brave to do it, because I often hear now on this moment that we need new legislation and we need this and we need that, but it's also possible that you are just brave as a judge because you can do a lot for victims in court when you just do it. I remember that 20 years ago we didn't have the right of speech in court in the Netherlands, but some of us did, because you are the one who gives order in a courtroom. So when you decide and all the parties agree, you can do it. You don't need all this big legislation for this. So I think that's very important to realize that's all the time, and that's why it's so important that we talk about and we have this discussion. I stop now because there are more important and people behind this table, and together they will tell you about their own experiences, and I hope that they take elements of the Safe Justice paper with them in their speech. And the first one who I give the floor is Joan Dean. She's sitting right to me, and Joan came really personally involved in victims' rights following the murder of your son Russell, if I understand. And you founded an organization called ADVIC, and that's an organization who advocates for the victims of homicide. And I hope you can tell us more about your personal experience and what we can do and what has to be done. Joan, please take the floor.
Thank you, Rosa. Good afternoon, everyone. As Rosa said, my experience with the criminal justice system began when my son was killed, and that was in 2003. Hello? No. Hello? No, is that better?
It's very low.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, okay. So genteel. Yeah, my experience began in 2003, following the murder of my son. And that happened 2 weeks after the breakup of a relationship. The brother and two friends of the girl he broke up with broke into his house and attacked him with weapons they picked up from his garden shed. That began, as you can imagine, I don't need to I'm sure tell anybody what a nightmare experience that was, and what an absolute devastation it was for my family. I suppose we thought that was the worst thing that had ever happened to us, and so it was. But we didn't realize that we were now embarking on a journey into the criminal justice system that would be equally as devastating in it for many different reasons. I suppose I can say we were lucky, and maybe luckier than some, in that a lot of our contact with the agencies of the criminal justice system were positive, quite positive. We had very good contact from the Gardaí in our country, the police. They were very supportive, very, very helpful. I suppose the first difficulty we encountered would have been the time frame. It was 2 years before the case came to trial, and there were the three young men were charged with murder. For various reasons, there were various complications during the trial period, and we ended up having 3 separate trials. I won't go into the details now, but I'm happy to answer questions if anybody wants to delve into it. There were mostly legal issues that caused collapse of the first trial. The second trial, one young man was acquitted because he didn't strike a blow, although he was part of the common design. The brother of the girl that my son had broken up with was found guilty of manslaughter, and that was okay. And the jury came back to ask a question of the judge, and for some inexplicable reason, he dismissed them. So that led to the third trial. And that was bad enough, but that all took another 18 months to happen. So there were huge delays in between. And at that trial, the final guy, who I believe was the main instigator of the attack, was found guilty of manslaughter, which felt like a huge injustice to us. It seemed really a wrong verdict, but we were told we have to accept the verdict of a jury. The DPP did offer to appeal it, but at that stage, to paraphrase the New Zealand Prime Minister, we had nothing left in the tank to go again. It didn't matter to me almost at that stage, because by then I had dismissed them in my head. Those people don't exist for me anymore. So that was basically the bones of it. But I think the real injustice during those trials was one defense team seemed to have a game plan that included getting me out of that courtroom for whatever reason. At each of the trials, when it first happened when the weapon was produced suddenly out of a bag, and I reacted and left the courtroom because I knew I was going to cry. And when I came back in, this defense team was on their feet asking the judge to collapse the trial because I was trying to influence the jury. Now, at that point, I was new to the criminal justice system. I didn't even know you could do that. So he didn't collapse the trial for that reason. But then at each of the subsequent trials, they closely monitored my reactions by standing at the edge of the pew where I was sitting. And any time a tear appeared on my face, they were looking to collapse the trial. And to be fair to the judge, 3 different judges, they didn't accede to their demand at any time, and told them more or less to get real. What did they expect the mother of a victim to do from time to time? So that had a huge impact on me. And I'm not a nervous Nelly, but that made me really, really nervous. And I was terrified to move a muscle in case I could collapse the trial. It meant there were periods when I couldn't be in the courtroom because I knew there might be sensitive information about the injuries my son had, and I couldn't risk causing the trial to collapse. You talk about safe justice. I felt that was very unsafe. But after the trials were finished, I did write to the Law Society to make a complaint because I felt it was completely unnecessary and nobody should have to, go through that sort of thing. And the reply I received from them was that they couldn't accept the complaint because I had not employed this the solicitor. The state had employed him. So no voice whatsoever, simply because I hadn't employed him. But it had a very profound impact on us. You mentioned, Advic, shortly after, even before the trials happened, shortly after my son was killed, I felt a strong need to meet another family who had been through the same thing. I contacted what was then Victim Support in Ireland, and I did meet some other families. And I suppose we had a very similar outlook on, they'd all been through the same thing and were at different stages of their journey. But we strongly felt that the system was very unbalanced and was weighted heavily in favour of the accused. And we felt there were aspects of it that didn't need to be like that, that it could be recalibrated. And so we set up ADVIC, and we began to work with the agencies in the criminal justice system for change, to advocate for change. But of course, change comes very slowly. And while, we did manage to, get through to people, and we found them very positive in their response to us. But what was lacking was empathy, I think. In theory, the information existed, but nobody seemed to realize that a traumatized victim, doesn't even know how to go about finding the information. In fact, you don't even know what you need to know at a certain point. So the first thing we did was gather all of the information together in a website and a booklet, and that was the first thing we did. We don't, you mentioned earlier, Lev, about leaflets. During the time immediately after my son was killed, somebody called to my house with a big bag of leaflets. And I was really taken aback by it and very suspicious about it at that stage, because all of your whole sense of security is gone at that point. And it was, in fact, it was a very well-intentioned volunteer who was working, with victim support. But it was a cold call, and I just felt this is not the way to do it. So in ADVIC, we never contact people. We don't reach out. We work with the guards, the Gardaí, and we give them the information. And when the family is ready, they come to us, and we help them as much as we can. We help them access support at court, I think, which is a very important service. Certainly it existed in Ireland when I was going through the courts. And without those volunteers who were able to explain to me what was happening, I didn't even know what a courtroom looked like, So they from the very basic, they take you through the courtroom, they show you everything, they explain what's going on. When legal arguments were happening, they were able to explain, don't panic, this happens. They even were able to provide a room which was, at that time, the judge's dressing room, where we could have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever. So hugely important. And I know that in Ireland, certainly, the support at court, people have become very sophisticated now, and they have dedicated victim suites, etc. In ADVIC, I think one of the main queries we get from people is around the area of criminal injuries compensation. Where do you even start with it? I think it's a problem in every country, but for us, it's up to now, it was on a non-statutory footing. And it is so complex and so complicated. You have to download the application form online, and it's a 24-page application form. It is the clunkiest, densest legal document or, application form. It's really terrible. And I think you have to do that whether your bike has been stolen or somebody has been murdered or you've been raped. It's the same application. And we believe that homicide and rape should be dealt with separately. It's just not enough to, fill in a form with your name and your numbers, etc., etc. I think you need human contact to be able to convey your distress and your situation, and for them to understand the trauma you're going through. So I think serious training is needed around that whole area. Now we have a really progressive justice minister in Ireland at the moment. She's on maternity leave currently, but she really has made a lot of changes, and she's suggested a lot of changes. Not all of them have been implemented, but she's doing really, really well. And she has recommended a review of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal. I thought change had happened there. I could not establish it from their website. So I thought, I'll ring them up and I'll speak to them, because that's the best way to find out. And the phone number, which is on their website, is out of service. So access is very difficult. I don't know how you do it at the moment. I'll have to follow that one up when I go back. So I think training, they did reach out to some organizations for input into their training program. And we did provide very complex training suggestions to them, but they didn't come back to us. And I don't know where that's at the moment. So I'm not very hopeful that things will change very quickly there. The guards are very open to change, and they're very open to listening to the voice of the victim. And I know sometimes it's not easy to maybe for an organization to deal with individual victims, but they could liaise with the NGOs who work with victims on the ground, because those are the people who can relay real situations, real life situations. I think education is another important area, and certainly following homicide, we're working on developing a schools program where we hope to go into schools and talk to young men in particular about the effects of violent action and homicide and death and all of that, and how it affects family life, because they're young, they don't understand, and they're maybe watching social media, which gives them a very warped sense of how women can be treated, and even other men can be treated. And I think that has to be countered with positive education. We're also developing a digital program, a digital support program, which we're going to launch next week. It's called Beat the Blues. It's an online CBT program for 16-year-olds upwards. And we're just working on another one, which is for younger children from, I think, the age of 12 to 16. And that one will be, it's like an online game, because children of that age are such digital natives, where they really may not be able to sit down in front of a counsellor. And we're finding it difficult enough to find specialist child counsellors. I suppose am I nearly there?
Yes.
Okay, I'll finish now.
Well, people who tell me that
Okay,
I have to
okay,
stop you, but it's so interesting to listen to.
If
you,
I have-
so that's
can I have
very
1 minute?
difficult. Yes,
1 minute.
1 minute. That's
I think one very important change that we definitely have been banging the drum about for a lot of years is that we need in Ireland either a victims ombudsman or a victims commissioner. We need this one-stop shop where victims can go to get information, where they will be listened to, and where they can bring a complaint if their rights are breached. It hasn't got any traction so far, but we will keep banging that drum, and hopefully it will happen one day. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. I think in a quite constructive way you describe your experiences, and I think it's good that we are here together because there's a lot of work to be done, but also happy to see that things happen even when it goes very, very slow. Shall we see if there are 2 questions on this moment? Later on, we have a little bit more time, but sometimes you have such an urgent question that you think, I want to ask it now. Is there someone who has an urgent question on this moment? No? None? Oh, later on we go on, but it's just that I don't want to let you be with your own question. Then I go to Akram. Akram Kubanich Bikov. I practice. Is that a good pronunciation? Yes, thank you. He's a senior advocacy officer and he's working for ILGA Europe, and he develops and implements advocacy strategy and policies initiatives to bring legal, political and social change for the LGBTI group. And I think you can tell more about this to us. Please take the floor.
Thank you for introduction. I would like to start to begin with how safe justice looks for LGBTI person in the example of journey of one victim of the crime, and it's the ideal, which might be kind of unicorn world, not existent. At least I didn't hear in my experience that this kind of scenario happened. So we could imagine that there's a transgender woman who is physically assaulted by a group of individuals because who she is, and you don't have to imagine because it's happening every day. And then what's the next step is that because campaign by the government on the rights of the victim is always happening, and she's aware of her rights, and she goes to report the crime to the police, and there she's provided with the information about her rights and the support services available to her, and including the option to seek medical attention, counseling, mental health support. And next step is that police take report seriously and investigate the crime, gather evidence, and identify the perpetrators. And all the time, victim is kept informed about the progress of the investigation and is provided with the support throughout the process, including safety planning and emotional support, which Levent was talking. It's right to protection. And then cases then referred to the prosecutor, and who works with the victim and to prepare her for the trial and ensures that her rights are protected throughout the process. And the prosecutor also seeks to enhance the punishment for the crime, specifically because this crime was based on victim's gender identity and perpetrator had the discriminatory motive. And then trial proceeds smoothly, and the victim is able to testify and provide evidence without fear of retribution and discrimination. And then she also received compensation. And then following the trial, victim is also provided with the support to recover from the crime and its impact, including ongoing counseling and access to victim support services. The police and prosecutor also work to ensure that victim is not subjected to any further victimization or discrimination, including any harassment or retaliation from the perpetrators or their associates. Even though perpetrators can end up behind the bars, usually associate can also pose a threat to victims of crime. So overall, this is the example of how an LGBTI, in this case, trans person, can access safe justice, including support and protection. They need to report a hate crime, participate in the criminal justice process, and recover from the crime. And most importantly, victim is treated with dignity and respect throughout the process, and their rights are protected by the criminal justice system. And as it was also highlighted by the Felipe, that they're reintegrated back to their life before they face the crime. But however, there are lots of challenges faced by the LGBTI victims of crime. in their journey to achieve safe justice. So this can include, and it's not only limited, but there's also other barriers, but I will stop on some of them. The one is the fear of reporting. LGBTI victims of crime may be afraid to report incidents to the police, particularly in those countries where the discrimination is widespread and stigma exists against LGBTI community, because police is also part from the community and they also share sometimes the prejudice the wider public has. And this fear may be based on the past negative experiences with authorities, or lack of the trust in the criminal justice, or lack of the information about their rights, just to name a few. The second barrier or challenges is the lack of awareness and understanding. So some police officer and criminal justice professionals may not have adequate training on how to work with LGBTI victims of crime. And this can also often result in insensitivity or lack of understanding of the unique challenges they face by the victims. And then there's also secondary victimization when they finally report by the police or other authorities. So victims may feel re-traumatized or experience secondary victimization during the reporting process, or as their case processes through the criminal justice system. And this can occur if the victim feels that they are not being taken seriously, which is actually one of the top replies why they do not report. Because when you don't prosecute one or take serious one reported crime, then what people do, you share with your family, you share with your friends that I reported, but nothing is happening. Then if your friend will happen to be a victim of the crime, then of course you will remember about that story and then you don't report. And secondary victimization is not only about incorrect questions or etc., but in cases of example, transgender women, but police often, we hear that police often also misgender if they didn't also go through the legal gender recognition, and which already strip them from their dignity. So these are some of the examples. And of course, there's also limited access to support services. During the pandemic, there was also, we heard a lot about access of trans people specifically, and in this case, transgender women of domestic violence, being denied from the single gender shelters, and they couldn't access and they couldn't go anywhere. They were on the streets. So these are the some of the and then so if they also often do not go to the they don't have also counseling, legal assistance, but I think it's not unique for only LGBTI, but it's as we hear from the other testaments that this exists when it comes to all victims of crime. And also further in the criminal justice system, there's also discrimination, and they can face discrimination not only from police officers, but prosecutors. Prosecutors sometimes treat hate crimes just ordinary crimes, and do not take bias motivation of the perpetrator, or even if prosecutors take, then judge doesn't take. So it continues, goes on, and this discourages LGBTI people to actually to go and try to access justice. So that's why it's important to address these challenges by providing adequate support, training, and also resources to ensure that LGBTI victims of crime can access safe justice, and also to just go forward, so that the example I gave from the very beginning will become reality. So thank you for your attention.
I look to the audience, and maybe the online audience, I don't know. But does anyone has a question on this moment to Akram? Yes, I see a hand over there.
Hello, my name is Amin Hashmi. I'm journalist from Europe and Africa. I'm Algerian, and we are also proud to promote our International Day of Living Together in Peace, the 16th of May, who was voted in the United Nations. My question is there really justice for victims in Europe? Because for our case, example, in Algeria and France, it was a lot of problems of colonialism. And until today, because they signed agreement of Evian, we can't go against France or what's happened in the colonialist time because it's a law. In the period of terrorism, Europe helped us. I'm speaking like journalist. It was 100 journalists killed in Algeria. And we come here in the heart of Europe and they tell us, we will help you. And they promise us 5 million euro and we're still waiting because it was voted, we never receive it. And the problem of this case, they tell to me, you know, Amin, it's 16 billion of share of affair between Europe and Algeria, then it's not easy to help journalists. And this is a shame, because today they ask Africa to support what's happened against this terrible war with Ukraine and Russia. And we admit we need to stop this war. But Europe is all time playing ostrich. Then it means they know there is problems. They know there is still victims. But they, with the law, they sign an engagement to not go farther. Today, Belgium, you know, the different office and the prime minister also, they are condemned because they didn't help victims of war. It's true, they are not European. They are from Syria, they are from Afghanistan or others. But today, the members of the prime minister will be seized by the law because he didn't do anything. Then today my question is there really a justice in Europe? And we can share this model of justice. I know the justice is free in Europe. That is, I'm proud to say that. And Africa is not free. Then if for you, there is a possibility really to act in justice for victims.
Okay, thank you very much. Ikram, I don't know if it's a question for you, but or for one of the others. Leven?
I can't answer the question in that way, and I'm certainly not an expert in global social, economic, and other kinds of politics. Some of the things that you say, though, it still comes back to the same concepts, really, because how are these decisions being made, why are they being made, and how are they being implemented, and where do you think about the victims within that process? So, as a general rule, can we get justice in Europe? Yes. We have amongst the most effective justice systems in the world across our member states. Are there large numbers of problems with you know, the normal level of criminal justice? Yours is another level of issue. Yes, there are still problems. What your point reminds me of is some of the struggles where there has been conflict, and for the UK, we've had the troubles in Northern Ireland, for example. We've had the difficulties in Spain, and there are other examples as well. What it reminds me of is the reconciliation processes, and where you have to make very difficult decisions as states and governments about how you go forward. And I can't say what the right answer is, but what I can certainly say is that when you don't involve victims in that process and don't take them along with you in that process, you can't really get effective reconciliation. And I think that's the kinds of concerns that we see coming up now with the decisions in the UK and with respect to the Northern Ireland. And it sounds similar with respect to Algeria. This should be, if it's victim sensitive, if it has this safe justice concept behind it, decisions may not go your way, but you should be part of the process and be heard within that. Has that happened? I'm sure in many cases it's not, but that's really, these principles are not just about criminal proceedings. They're really about our social cohesion as a society and how we engage across borders as well.
Thank you. I look around. Is one of the others want to give a reaction? Then I go on with you. I see a hand. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Larissa. I'm from Institute from European Studies. This question will be maybe for Akram more. I'm just curious to know how much the court are applying framework of intersectionality to maybe better explain to all is like intersection of multiply of discrimination and how you deal with that, because it's not like the same level of someone having the just one discrimination, let's say, and forming multiply discrimination in one person. So if you need further explanation, I'm here.
Yes, thank you. So intersectional approach is when, for example, they mentioned in my example, mentioned trans woman happens to be also a migrant and engaged in sex work, then she would have more than one city. And all, so she could suffer, for example, attack based on that she was, to begin with, engaged in sex work, second, trans person, and then third, she was a migrant, so there would be mix of the biased motives. And in this case, with the courts, we hear rarely because it depends. To begin with, it depends from the like police that they record the bias motives correctly, and here, and then they pass to the prosecution, and prosecution also takes all these three biased motives and ask for the aggravation of the penalty, or and then it up to the judge. But we even in most cases we even do not reach to the third, to the judiciary when judges will decide, but we end up that police do not take into account because they don't think that it's serious, or they don't have system how to record it. But in many member states in the EU they do actually have, but even if they have, they usually it's in one bias. So I think it's the area which should be improved, and we hope actually with the extension of the EU crimes to include hate crime and hate speech, that EU legislator or co-legislators will come up, also will consider how to record and how to address this hate crimes based on the intersection of on intersectional identities as well. So thank you. I hope that I answered the question. Thank you.
Other questions on this moment? See another finger. Can it be a short question?
Yes.
Because
Very short question for Mr. Akram. It was a pleasure to me to make with the Vice President of Europe an interview about what's happened in Qatar. And I would like to know, because for us also the word is a weapon. And in these football games, everybody know it was forbidden to show her LGBT of his gender. What was your position about the victim? How we can also help the victim who was, since it was not a law, and Europe and the world don't say anything. I'm proud of my Minister of Foreign Affairs, Haj Al Habib, who did. I'm proud of the minister from Germany. She's also did something. I'm proud of all people who they tried to put this love. What was the position of Ilga? And do you think we can do something? Because today, after the Qatar Gate, I think it's time to Europe to act.
Thank you for this. I think it's more question to my colleagues who are working on the broader kind of with the political, specifically political issues. And we happen to be actually do have publication on the specifically on this issue on our website, and I'm happy to share with you if after the meeting I can have your email and reply officially. I hope that it answers the question. Thank you for the question.
Okay, please. Do we have a mic? Yes.
I have a question for Mr. Kubanish Bekov. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't speak fluently English. Then I will ask you my question in French. Ah. Oui, ça va. Merci. J'ai moi-même été victime à plusieurs reprises de crimes de haine en tant que personne transgenre, et j'ai à chaque fois, par principe, porté plainte auprès de la police. Et j'ai constaté... Oui. Donc, je répète. Oui, j'ai été à plusieurs reprises victime de haine, de crimes de haine à mon égard en tant que personne transgenre.
As a transgender person, I've been several times victim of hate crime.
Et je tiens à souligner le fait que au niveau de l'accueil de la police, de la prise en charge, il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire.
I would like to say that there is much more to be done from the police in terms of reporting the crime and being welcome in the station.
Car pour moi, personnellement, la base quand on subit une agression, transphobe, homophobe, la base, c'est déjà l'accueil et le sentiment de protection que nous inspire la police.
For me, the most important is this feeling of safety from the police and the way that they welcome us in the station.
Dans mon cas personnel, ça a été chaque fois l'indifférence, un peu d'arrogance, mais surtout l'indifférence.
For me, the most difficult was I'm not sure in English, indifference, and the lack of recognition.
En ce qui me concerne, je parle en mon nom et au nom de mes amis qui ont été confrontés à la même situation.
I speak for my name and on behalf of all my friends who've been confronted to this situation.
Et là où je voudrais m'adresser à monsieur, c'est en ce qui concerne le dépôt de plainte. J'ai à plusieurs reprises déposé plainte auprès de la police pour des agressions transphobes.
My question is for Akram because I've been several times going to the police to report crimes.
Et ce qui est étonnant, c'est que mes plaintes, à plusieurs reprises, ont été classées comme des agressions, non pas transphobes ou homophobes, mais comme des agressions racistes.
And several times my claims were filed as racist and not transphobic crimes, aggressions.
J'ai fait part de mon étonnement, aux personnes qui étaient responsables de la prise en charge et de la rédaction du PV.
I expressed my surprise to the police officers who are writing the complaints.
En leur expliquant qu'en ce qui me concerne, il ne s'agissait pas d'agression raciste, mais d'agression transphobe. Quand je dis raciste, c'est dans mon cas personnel, mes agressions étaient causées par des jeunes hommes d'origine maghrébine. Je précise que je suis également moi-même d'origine maghrébine.
For me personally, these aggressions against me were about transphobia and not racism, and the people who attacked me were from Maghreb, and I'm also from Maghreb.
Et donc j'ai attiré l'attention à chaque fois des personnes qui étaient responsables de la prise en charge de mon PV, en leur expliquant qu'il ne pouvait pas s'agir d'agression raciste, étant donné que moi-même et mes agresseurs, tout à fait, étions des mêmes origines.
So I explained to the police officer that for me it couldn't be considered as a racist aggression because I had the same background as my offenders.
Et donc ma question, est-ce que cette manière de classer les agressions, au lieu de les classer en tant qu'agression transphobe, mais de les classer en tant qu'agression raciste, cela n'est pas fait dans un but bien précis?
Is this approach of classifying an aggression or crime as a racist rather than transphobic, isn't it something that is made on purpose with a specific goal?
That's my question.
Thank you very much. I truly cannot really answer if it was the intent or they consider that you have more chance with the classifying crime like that. So without being there, it's hard to really establish what was the intention behind. But by ideally, as I said, police should recognize that it was hate motivated by the transphobia and not by the racism. And ideally, they should, even if they had that it might be, they consider it if it was racist. And if you said that no, it was a transphobic attack, then they should record both, as in the previous question. So both, and address and work on both of them. But it might also happen, so we can here definitely see like inappropriate classification. You also mentioned that about secondary victimization, that there was also like arrogant and other kind of attitude from the police. And this specifically says about the lack of awareness from the criminal justice system about LGBTI people and what kind of specific challenges they face. For example, transphobia is not the same as racism. And this is maybe because it's from the lack of understanding that this was a message specifically to you and to the wider community in this crime, if it was specifically hate crime. So this is one of the examples actually of the how system fail LGBTI people to be seen, to be heard, and also to provide protection. I don't know about what happened further, but this is one of the very sad examples of how criminal justice system treats LGBTI people. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes.
Just to add something to
Just
this.
short,
But it's really about the complexity of the response. This is why safe justice is a comprehensive system. You can be talking about lack of knowledge, poor behavior, personal biases, all of those things. No one action will resolve everything. That's why you need the training to achieve behavior change, but you also need the tools to address poor behavior. You need the legal remedies and ability of a victim to complain when something isn't done right. You need also to have the accompaniment. When someone is accompanied by victim support professionals or a lawyer, the treatment, especially when you're a vulnerable victim in certain kinds of situations, like in this situation, you're treated differently when you're accompanied by a professional. So it's this combination which is essential.
Do you see they show us all these plates? But thank you, Lev, because I think the most important thing, when we listen to all these questions, is that we can conclude that the criminal procedure is becoming quite complicated, and that's what we hear from all victims, that when you don't have the good support, not only emotional but also legal, judicial, it's very difficult to get into this how do you call it, area, because you need so much. For example, you can ask for protection measures and that kind of things, but when you don't know, you are sitting there. Most of the time, it's a one of second time that it happens to you, and then it's very difficult to make the right step. That's, I think, why it's so important that we have the Safe Justice paper, because there's also described that you really need assistance from people who have been experienced and trained in this area.
En ce qui me concerne, dans mon cas, moi personnel, j'ai dû insister pour qu'on réintitule la plainte, qu'on la réadapte, non pas en tant qu'agression raciste, mais agression transphobe. J'ai dû insister pour la dernière agression qui s'est passée au mois d'août. J'ai dû vraiment insister. Pour les précédentes, c'est resté agression raciste.
So, I don't know if you understood, she had to insist herself to have it changed.
Yes.
But I think that's also, I mean, there is something where you are able to do that as an individual and have the courage and the ability to do that, but so many others don't, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And they never come back at the police station, and that's so pity, you know. In a lot of cases, you see that crime is going down, but in fact, most of the cases are never investigated or prosecuted. And I think when you talk about victims, then you have really victimization and secondary victimization. Okay, thanks for your question. I go to Philippe. I think you don't need an introduction now because we have spoken to you already, but maybe it's good that you tell your story out of your personal experience on this moment. Is that a good idea? Yes, please.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Personal experiences. I mean, in my case, so I lost my sister on the 22nd of March, 2016. So soon it's going to be 7 years. It always remains difficult. We have now the prosecution going on. We have ups and downs. As victim, you can feel really good right now and bad in 5 minutes, or vice versa. And so I heard a couple of times saying here that we need to have this human contact, and I think this is extremely important. Often on the legal side and also from society in general, the people who are putting into place all the support, which is really necessary, it's fundamental, often they don't talk the same language as the victims themselves, because the victims are again rebuilding themselves. The values might be a little bit different, so this human contact is extremely important. And it also, and this is a difficulty in our society, is providing the time to the victims. Too often the victims have no time to rebuild themselves because it's just not feasible. Often victims are affected also financially. They have costs, debts or whatever, and so they are obliged to continue. And this is even more the case, even I have to say this, for women. When a woman is a victim, often when she has children, she has so much burdens. The children, they can't wait. They have to be fed every day. They have to go to school. Who will take all this role over? So I would say for a woman, the time is even more important because she can't stop. She can't stop even 24 hours. And so how she's going to rebuild herself? This is something I also wanted to touch base. And then we've got also, of course, the children who are victim. This is something extremely difficult. We all want that these children have the right support so that they can become grown-up adults who can really reintegrate society. So these are 2 points I also want to touch base. We often see also with decision makers, and now I'm talking about the politicians, that they have a hearing, but they don't want to start to do the proper work because it's too expensive. But okay, it's maybe too expensive in their terms as an elected politician, but in the long run, it's going to be even more expensive if you don't do it properly. So it's better to install a right system that provides the possibility for the victims to rebuild themselves, find resilience, reintegrate society, have justice to be done in the right way. Okay, it's going to be expensive, but if you do it properly, these people again become part of society. If you don't do it properly, these people will suffer post-trauma and so on, and it's going to be a huge cost on the social system of the member states. So for me, justice is there. Justice is about the law, it's about society, the message we give to society, but of course it's also about victims. They're all equally important, and if you provide the right support to the victims and bring them in the right spot, then in fact, what you're doing, you're combating injustice in the right way, and that's what we need to do. Personal experience.
I look around. Is there anyone who want to ask a question to Philip or to someone else? Yes, please. We need a mic.
So much. My name's Paola Grenier. I'm from the Validity Foundation. We work on disability rights, and I've been working for the past few years on the rights of people with disabilities who are victims of crime, who really experience some of the most challenging circumstances. I've heard so much about the experiences people here today, which is really hugely challenging. But I hear about people with disabilities who can't even get into a police station, who don't even have a telephone to report a crime on, who when they do make a report are called weird, are told that they are not credible witnesses, or they cannot be interviewed because where's their guardian? Whose guardian is then somebody who may actually be the perpetrator of the crime. And in our analysis and our thinking on this, we came to the idea that there's a lot of power play going on here. And I just want to quote that one of our consultants, when he was supporting us in our work, he made this statement about the justice system and its symbols are scary. In most places, courts are not about justice, they are about power. For anyone facing these symbols of power, it's disabling. Start by thinking about defocusing that power. The focus should be on justice. It's about the humanization of the justice system itself. And I just really wondered if you have some thoughts or ideas about that more explicit notion of we know the power relations and the power that the different players in the legal system have, not only over victims, it feels like. And so I just was asking for some of your responses to that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Lev?
Yes. I think there's lots of evidence of that in the experiences, not just of victims with disabilities, but many victims in many ways. But I think it intersects with all sorts of other aspects of, who has control, how easy is the system, what are you trying to achieve from the system as well. So I think about the movement from having the gowns and the wigs and everything else because people feel, and judges and others felt, that you have to have this level of austerity within the justice system to demonstrate to the accused the seriousness of the situation. And I think these are really good things to examine. Do we need to review whether that's actually achieving the ultimate objectives? And what do we mean by achieving justice? Even that is something that should be looked at. And I think sometimes these power symbols of them become just habits. And that's part of the point of what we're doing with Safe Justice, is questioning whether we need to continue with the ways in which we're working, or whether we need to first of all look at what are the needs of the participants in this system, and then organize solutions around them. And I think with disability issues, what also we forget is that if you get your system right for them, you get it right for everyone. Actually, there's so many people who will benefit from the same solutions as would victims with disabilities. So I think that there's so much about what you say, and trying to pull some of these things apart and question it. We've got used to a justice system operating in a certain way. Nobody wants to rock the boat. It's already it's already taking too long to make justice work. Well, we need to ask these questions, because I think otherwise there's so many people that will be dissatisfied with the system.
Yes, and maybe when I was a long part of that system, not with a wig, but without a wig, but it's the same system, I think. But I think it's very important, because I don't believe that there are working people who don't want to know, but they have a sort of a blindness, you know. So it's very important to have the conversation with all the professional parties, if I may say. And I think you can do it in training together. That I think can be very successful. I think also this afternoon the stories of the people here behind the table makes a lot of impression. And what my organization in the Netherlands did in the recent past is that we made a white book, so not a black book, as you know, with all bad examples, with good examples. And we were quite successful with this white book because we told them what I did well, but only one judge did it, or one prosecutor, or one policeman did it, and we gave them the example. You can do that in every procedure. So I think also with the Safe Justice paper, a lot of work has to be done, I think. And yes, you need brave people who start to do things, because it's also a power network. So, but people have to look in the mirror. So.
No, thank you very much. I very much like this white book idea. I think finding ways to reach people and connect. Yeah.
Do you want to say? Yeah. Yes.
I agree with you. I like the sound of that white book as well. Somebody once said, when you go into a court, you're going to get law, not necessarily justice. But of course, what you're talking about, and a lot of the people we speak to as well, the injustices are happening long before you get to court. Just not being listened to, just not being... I think there's a big difference between hearing and listening. And somebody can tell their story to, you know, a policeman or whoever, but being heard is very different. And I think that's the initial injustice. And the people you describe, I can only imagine how disempowered they feel, and it just doesn't even bear thinking about. But they're I don't know where you work. What country do you work in? Okay, because it sounds like a situation where there ought to be a very strong network of NGOs who will, you know, be there initially for these people. And maybe again, training is important, where at police level, that when they're confronted with a victim who has a disability of any kind, they would contact this NGO organization to represent them. And hopefully that might make a difference.
Maybe just to pick up on this, I mean, that there's three levels of change. One is at the personal or individual level. You know, a judge or a prosecutor has a power in their own rights. But there's also the legal level, and there's the infrastructural level. So when it comes to something like the ability of a victim with disability to present their evidence, to be believed in the courtroom, which is often some of the barriers that you experience, at least for mental health, mental disability issues. You need to create a structure around those prosecutors and judges which enables the victim to be heard, because if you expect that a police investigator or someone will off their own just be able to make this happen, it's not true. You have tools, you have very clear methods by which you can enable someone to give their best evidence, but you have to have that in place. We've worked on facility dogs most recently, but there's the use of dolls, there's the interview rooms. There are so many ways, but this is all about the structure around those people, because I'm sure that prosecutors and lawyers who are listening to this are like, yes, but you have no idea. We have to get through 100 cases per X. How on earth am I supposed... So you need to have a structure which enables them to do their job, but also meets the needs of victims. And actually, if you do both and you start introducing efficiencies with AI and other things, you'll be able to help victims, but also do that in a much more effective and efficient way.
Thank you. Yes, there is another question.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if this person. Hello, my name is Lucas Stevenson. I work for the European Sex Worker Rights Alliance. We're a network of 100 organizations that provide services to people who work in the sex industry in Europe. I had like one comment and one question. I think like reflecting as well what you were saying, like we know for many marginalized communities, accessing justice is still very, very difficult. And the first obstacle is that very few victims will actually report to the police. In many cases, the police can themselves be perpetrators of crimes. But also we know that, for example, for like trans people or for migrants or for sex workers, going to the police also brings lots of risk. And I was recently like discussing with a colleague, a sex worker in Portugal that was victim of domestic violence. And she was explaining that she had the courage to bring the case to the police and then to the court where she was denouncing her husband who had been abusing her for many years. And when she went to court, the judge actually said, "You deserved it, you're a sex worker. If I was your husband, I would have done the same thing." And this is the kind of example we hear as sex workers all the time. So I really applaud the work of Victims Support Europe in bringing victims' voices to Europe. But I think there's so much more that needs to be done to tackle the stigma that some specific community face. And I wanted to ask like a more specific questions on migrants' access to justice. I feel that for many undocumented migrants, we still know that it's very difficult to report any form of crime because of the risk of deportation. And I was happy to hear from Mr. José Diaz that in the potentially anti-trafficking directive, there will be potential regularization of victims of trafficking. And I was wondering if there is any more work that is being done to ensure that undocumented migrants are able to access justice, to report crime like other citizens. Thank you.
I don't know what I'm not up to speed on what precisely they're proposing. There's the Human Trafficking Directive, which is one aspect, but I don't think this is really what that's about. This is a different situation. I don't think it's clear for me how they're proposing to better protect victims in this situation. What we are saying as a starting point is that there needs to be a firewall system in place. In countries like Netherlands, they have a system. It's not perfect. But the starting point is for victims to know that if they report the crime, their data is secure and won't be passed on to immigration authorities. So that's the starting point, I think. And that's something we're pushing for. I don't know whether the Commission will include it in their proposal, but hopefully they will. And if not, of course, we'll push for that with the European Parliament as well. I think in terms of other legislation, I'm not aware of anything in there, but I think it's something which we've seen working with PICUM and with other organisations. It's really critical. A big part of the report is on the ability to report, but then once you're in the system, how do you take into account that the particular risks of that group and of each individual? So if you're, as a migrant victim, if you're in your visa status may be put at risk if you report in a domestic violence situation. Your community may not be supportive of you. There are so many different levels in which documented and undocumented migrants and asylum seekers are all prevented from reaching the system, and then when they're in the system they face all sorts of prejudices. So those are all aspects of the safe justice system that we're pushing. We hope that the European Commission will incorporate some of these in their proposal, and we understand that at least one part of how they're approaching the solutions is to have a focus on the most vulnerable victims as well.
Thank you. Philip.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something because we talked about the white book, so let's start now. I wanted to say something about our experiences regarding terrorism here in Belgium. The attacks from 22nd of March. We had a wonderful, beautiful experience with a case where an illegal person was sadly a victim. He was fully supported, recognized, and received the same rights as a Belgian citizen. So it is possible. I want to say this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very short question. Is that possible? We need the translation because that's easier.
Donc j'ai une question destinée à Monsieur Philippe. Tout à l'heure, en fait, j'aimerais rebondir sur une petite phrase que vous avez, en fait une petite phrase, un constat que vous avez fait tout à l'heure.
I would like to go back to one sentence that you said before, Philippe.
Corrigez-moi si je me trompe, mais j'ai l'impression que tout à l'heure vous avez dit que quand une personne est victime de haine,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but before you said that if a person is a victim of hate,
il faut éviter d'avoir un sentiment de pitié.
you shouldn't have pity for that person.
Est-ce que c'est exact, c'est ce que vous avez dit tout à l'heure?
That's what you said before, right?
Yeah, I think for any victim, pity is not the right answer. We need to provide support, but also the victims, the real work when you are a victim where you have been affected, the real work, only the victim itself or herself can do that resilience work. What society has to provide, what is in fact the duty, is to provide the right surroundings so that the victim can rebuild him or herself. And so pity is not a good way.
Parce que moi, dans mon cas personnel, justement, et j'aurais tellement aimé pouvoir bénéficier d'un peu de pitié ou d'un peu d'empathie, justement.
Empathy. In my personal case, I would have liked to receive a bit more empathy.
Parce qu'il faut savoir que les crimes de haine, suivant qu'il s'agit d'un enfant, qu'il s'agit d'une femme, qu'il s'agit d'un noir, qu'il s'agit d'un blanc, ou qu'il s'agit une trans ou un transsexuel ou d'un gay, l'attitude des gens n'est pas la même. Du moins, les gens qui assistent, leur réaction n'est pas du tout la même.
For hate crime victims, if it's a child, a woman, an adult, a black or white person, the attitude of the people towards them is completely different.
Tout à fait.
I can fully hear what you're saying. I just want to point out that maybe it's an interpretation, but for me, there is a difference between the empathy and having pity. It's a huge difference. So maybe we can afterwards talk about how we see what is the difference between empathy and pity. But empathy, of course, we need to have empathy. We need to have respect. We have to keep this human contact and this human approach. It's really necessary for the victims, but not the pity. But I can.
Mais justement, dans mon cas, c'est l'indifférence la plus totale. Les gens assistent, mais ils ne réagissent pas. Ils regardent.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we come to the last part of the program, but I like to thank our panelists, the people in the panel, for their contribution, because I think it's every time you need the power and you need the energy to sit here and to tell your story. And I understand very well that, of course, it's very important to tell the story, but sometimes relatives and victims tell me that at the end of the day, it's also quite emotional because you went into the story again, and it's a sort of again go to the whole story. So thank you that you want to be here and to share it with us, because I think we can see how important it is to be here together and to see what kind of work has to be done. We sit here in the framework of in the context of the European Day or Week of the victim of a crime. But I think as we sit here and as we do our work, or if you are a relative or a victim yourself, I think it's every day Victims Day, and that's very important. I think to keep that in mind, because I think that's an important beginning of next steps. And I always say myself when I'm allowed to talk in my own country to politicians or whatever people, that it's a sign of a civilized society which treats his victims in a very good way. I think, because I think we have to ensure there is no victim who is not seen, who is forgotten, and who has no voice. And I think that's very important to bring that in every day. And thank you so much. Thank you all. And then I give the floor to our other Vice President of Victim Support Europe for the closing remarks. Jerome.
Thank you, Rosa. Dear participants, on behalf of all organizers of the European Days for Victims of Crime, it is my pleasure to make a few closing remarks and express gratitude to the audience and panelists for coming and joining us in this important discussion. Our gratitude goes to the event speakers for making this happening a success. Alors, Richard Sonnenschein, José Antonio Moreno Diaz, Philippe Van Stikiste, John Dean, Akram Kubanic Bikov, Petra Klein, Leven Alten, and our president, Rosa Jensen. Today's debate showed the importance of intersectorial cooperation to develop and maintain a comprehensive justice system that is less harmful to victims and victims' families. The discussion emphasizes the role all sectors of society must play in supporting victims of crime throughout criminal justice proceedings. These examples help to highlight how essential it is to collaborate. By working together, agencies can provide services that are more efficient and effective than they would have been if those agencies acted alone. The advantages this offers in relation to viable criminal justice partnership are several and clear. During 2023, Victims Support Europe will work explicitly to clarify laws, policies, and practices to better support the victim we represent. And we will look to raise public, professional, government, and victims' awareness of the work being carried out to provide victims with access to safe justice at their time of need. In the 21st century, the most vulnerable in our societies must be taken care of. Justice systems should be safe for victims, protecting them as much as the accused. This is why, together, we welcome the commitment of the European Commission to update European victims' laws and look forward to it urgently publishing a new victim directive. This is a new opportunity to transform how we think about victims' rights and about their access to support, justice, and protection. A robust Victims Rights Directive will form a strong foundation for all victims of all crime, including, for example, victims of terrorism, victims with disabilities, victims of harassment, child sexual abuse, victims who are not covered by current European proposals. It will complement specialist laws focused on specific groups of victims, ensuring a comprehensive system to protect and support every victim. Victims Support Europe and our members support the publication of the new Victims Rights Directive to ensure that no victim is forgotten and remain voiceless. I would like to thank you all once more for your active participation in this event. I hope it has been informative. Thank you. Alors, and then we would like to take a group pictures. Yes. So I invite you to follow Ruben. Thank you so much.